Hi everyone, thank you for your patience while we were setting up. Welcome to the new book seminar series of the Department of Media Communications, Creative Arts, Languages and Literature. I'm Tom Burdett. I'm here to kind of steward things today. Before we launch into today's discussion and before I introduce our fabulous speaker and guests and hand over to Karen Pearlman, who is here with us, I'd like to just provide a brief acknowledgement of country. So I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the Macquarie University land, the Wadawurrung people of the Darug Nation, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. Since the dream time, we pay our respects to elders past, present and future. And I also invite everyone to reflect on and acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the lands upon which you may be finding yourselves in the Zoom space. Okay, so today we have the really exciting opportunity to hear from Emeritus Professor Kathryn Millard talking about her recent book from Rutgers University Press, Double Exposure, How Social Psychology Fell in Love with the Movies. This is our first hybrid event, so we are going to be trying to run this discussion in Zoom as well as here in the screen studio or the drama studio. So I will now be handing over to Karen and Kathryn for the discussion. I'm here to just basically run things on the Zoom. Feel free to drop questions and responses in the chat. We will have a discussion and some film screenings, and then maybe around 4:40 we'll open it up for discussion from everyone in Zoom and here in the room, and we should be finished by 5 o'clock. Okay, so without further ado, I will hand over to Karen.
And I can tell you, this is a damn good read. You should just read it because it's so much fun to read. It's also, you will learn a lot, so you will feel like one of those really cool, very smart people who learns a whole lot of things and can talk insightfully about a whole bunch of things, but you'll always really enjoy reading it. So I really can honestly recommend it. This is the book blurb on the back. Double Exposure. It's called Double Exposure, How Social Psychology Fell in Love with Movies. And the blurb says, Double Exposure examines the role of film in shaping social psychology's landmark post-war experiments. We are told most of us will inflict electric shocks on fellow citizens when ordered to do so. Act as a brutal prison guard when put in a uniform. Walk on by when we see a stranger in need. But as Kathryn tells us, and we learn in this book, there is much more to the story. Documentaries that investigators claimed as evidence were central to capturing the public imagination. Did they provide an alibi for 20th century filmmakers? Examining the dramaturgy, staging, and filming of these experiments, including Milgram's obedience experiments, the Stanford Prison experiment, and many more, Double Exposure recovers a new set of narratives. And narrative is important because a lot of this book is about the way that these social psychologists told stories. And you're a writer. I think you have a lot to say.
Thank you for that very kind introduction and for inviting me today, and thank you to Bridget and the department for inviting me today. Such a kind introduction. You're doing such a great job. I don't think you should just keep going.
Oh, all right. I thought I'd just read the book. It's a really good book.
And buy it.
All right. Well, so the book then, as the book is something that has grown out of many years of research, and in my mind, it's kind of part of a multimodal investigation. I feel like there's investigation happening through film, investigation happening through some, social psychology essays that you're writing with the psychologists, and there's investigation happening here. And it's really interesting to me how they all fit together. But I thought maybe we'd start by going way back. Where did this all start for you? How did this fascination?
That's a very good question. It's been interesting to try and remember when I became really interested in these psychology experiments, and I told different versions of that in the story. There were really several main experiments that I was interested in, these landmark experiments after the Second World War. Social psychologists study people in groups, a subject enormously interesting, of course, I think, to filmmakers and people who work in theatre and performance and collaborative forms. To me, it's a kind of natural fit. I'm fascinated by group dynamics. And there were some landmark experiments about, in particular, Stanley Milgram's obedience to authority in the 60s, about which claimed that investigated how people behave when they're placed under pressure. And he kind of built on Solomon Asch's experiment about conformity and independence in the 50s, but made it much more dramatic. So Milgram's was an experiment that kind of doubled as what he called a laboratory drama. And that idea really interested me, that you could dramatize something about this aspect of human behavior, which I think that he did extraordinarily successfully through workshopping, writing a kind of drama, workshopping it with his students, applying for funding, and creating this huge experiment that involved 1,000 people who were residents of New Haven, where Yale University is, and famously asking them to inflict what they thought were shocks on a learner, but unbeknown to the participants, they weren't in fact any real shocks. It was a very elaborate kind of setup to look like that. So he crafted these experiments with a very high level of kind of dramaturgy, set design, rehearsal with non-professional actors and so on. So it was really the Milgram one that firstly really grabbed my attention, and that I spent a lot of time writing about and working on a film called Shock Room about. And then the other two key ones are, which I'll talk about more in a while, are Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment in the 1970s, and then later the bystander experiments in the 1970s. But the one that really stands out for its dramaturgy and craft is, I think, Milgram's obedience. But as we were saying, visual evidence, these films promoted a very conformist notion of human behaviour. It said that most of us will harm others when pressured to do so. Most of us will work on by and not help a stranger in need. Most of us will adopt the role of a guard, a prisoner, and abuse prisoners if we're given the uniform. But in fact, those experiments are so much more complicated than that. Firstly, they're dramas. I find it very difficult. I have real questions about them as experiments. What does it mean to take data on dramas? I mean, I don't know. This just wasn't my idea of science.
Right.
Fortunately, Milgram had this amazing archive and left a lot of things that we could look at. So to go back to your question, this is one of the possible beginnings. I may have first heard about Zimbardo, about Stanley Milgram's obedience to experiment when I was a university student, and I think that I did. I was a very poor psychology student because I loved history and theory of psychology, which I excelled at, I think, but I hated and was dreadful at statistics. And this sort of has been the trajectory of my life ever since, really. So here's one version about how I may have come to this. When I was 20, you can see I dropped out of university very quickly, which I also confess to in this book, but I've certainly redeemed myself since. I did get back on the educational path later. When I was 20, I worked briefly in a juvenile detention centre for kids in trouble with the law. After a riot made local headlines, this was in Adelaide, I was one of several community workers brought in to be new brooms. The minimum age rule was waived on my account. I was motivated by a mix of idealism and pragmatism. Again, probably still today. I hoped to change some kids' lives for the better. Additionally, I needed the money, since the first community worker jobs I took were unpaid. Footage of Milgram's documentary Obedience, 1965, and Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment featured in the boot camp style induction, or did they? I recall the experiments being discussed in our training. I recall being taken to a prison cell and shut inside. The thinking behind this was that the experience would help us identify with our juvenile charges. If that was indeed the rationale, it worked only too well in my case. I began to feel that I was serving time. In fact, so ill-suited was I to the position of jailer, I was soon let go. I was apparently an inappropriate authority figure. And again, it's an assessment of my character that I actually feel was quite accurate and one I'm very proud of. I became a community media worker, then an independent filmmaker, completed postgraduate work in history and film. I told you I redeemed myself. I became a university professor of screen. So the questions that came back to me from that were, why do we tell stories about groups that emphasize compliance and obedience rather than independence and cooperation? The familiar narratives from these incredibly well-known experiments that are still enormously influential are only half the picture. There's considerable evidence most people refuse to harm others. We do not routinely identify with assigned roles, that strangers do find sufficient ways to work together during crisis. But I guess this is how I teamed up with social psychologists. New evidence alone has been not enough to tell the shift of the story. There's endless new evidence that kind of really challenges that kind of narrative that's become so embedded in our collective psyche. So I was working with the idea that as individuals and communities, we are the stories I tell. And stories are not just nice things. I think that we often have this extraordinary romanticized notion when somebody says, we're all storytellers. Well, excuse me, we're not. I don't think so. I think that stories are things that live and act on the world. They can bring people together. They can divide them. They're organisms, they live. They're not templates. But we're also the stories that we have the narrative resources to tell, which is an idea that I borrowed from cognitive psychologist Jerome Bruner, whose work I've loved for a very long time, and more recently, Arthur Frank. So I guess going back to that beginning, this was always on my mind, these experiments. I made a lot of other films in the arts. It was always on my to-do list one day. And eventually, in 2008, I sent a request to the archives at Yale to look at Milgram's work as a filmmaker. And that began kind of 15 years immersed in these experiments, particularly Stanley Milgram's obedience to authority. But then I became really interested in some of the other key experiments, and that what they had in common was that we couldn't shift the story. Filmmakers, writers, psychologists alike, that it was so hard to shift the story, and why was it?
And why? And that's I think that's a really interesting question. And you mentioned Jerome Bruner, and he actually gets quoted, page 41, if you want to look it up, in the book, as this: we do not simply tell stories about our world, rather the stories we tell shape that world. And it feels like these social psychology experiment / stories really have shaped the world. And I mean, and that comes out in a number of chapters that I hope we'll talk about specific ways that they've done them. But I'm interested in your, it's kind of like you came into the university that kind of shuts down. You'd already been a very successful filmmaker working in the sort of more traditional roots of film funding and so forth. But inside the university, it's tricky. We have some different kinds of freedom, but some different kinds of responsibilities. And I'm just really interested if you can talk a little bit about the filmmaking as research, and especially the kinds of investigation that you're doing as research, because I know there's this kind of an odd, like they thought they were doing research, but maybe they were telling stories. You're making films, but you're doing research. There's just an interesting kind of overlaps there.
Sure. Can I just say before that the Jerome Bruner idea of stories constructing the world and acting on the world was really integral to me for a really long time in my work writing about thinking as a filmmaker and screenwriter, and an idea that I drew on a lot in the book about screenwriting. So it wasn't only that I was coming to that work around psychology, it was a really important idea to me. And so there's a kind of link to that work. Filmmaking is research. Sure. I think these are things that many of us have talked about for a while. I guess you're right. I started out making, I guess I come from an independent filmmaker background, where there once was, I think, a really vital sense of independent film and community and industry organisations and more work that crossed drama and documentary, etc., where pre-sales to television, all of that were much less kind of significant thing, or broadcasters or whatever. So that was kind of my beginnings, working in that kind of independent filmmaking scene. First, working as a kind of arts administrator in my 20s for a long time, and beginning to make films, and then making features in more traditional industries ways as that changed, both documentaries and features. And so the first part of my university career, when it became very obvious to me, firstly that I really loved research and scholarship. I did a master's in history and then a doctorate of creative arts that I just loved. It was really immensely enjoyable and pleasurable to me. So that was part of the motivation for wanting to be in a university. It was also really clear to me, someone who's independently minded and who liked experimentation and didn't subscribe to any of the templates on screenwriting, which was something I spent a lot of time doing, and was always arguing about that draft by draft. But maybe it'd be a really good idea to actually have some other way of earning a living. I confess, this was definitely on my mind, that it might allow me more freedom in that kind of way. I felt quite critical of some aspects of kind of industry. And I wanted to be separate from that and to be more in a research environment and with people that were not only in my field. And Macquarie has a reputation of somewhere being quite interdisciplinary, so that was extremely attractive to me. So I guess my career started more by still working on dramas like Park Planners and Travelling Life, draft by draft, and piecing together money, and take it in a more traditional way. So I worked here, and I had a record amount of unpaid leave to make those films. But at a certain point, I kind of wanted to integrate those different parts of my life form, and to make films in a different way, where you didn't have that kind of jigsaw of funding. They were really fantastic to have those resources. But the process of spending many, many years making, of kind of writing and shaping something, whether it's a feature script, and then getting the money to make it, it might take, typically for me, it would take 7 years. And then there's an enormous amount of pressure at the end. And I realised that I wanted something that was not only more research-based, but also that allowed to process more. So to me, especially here, once we actually got these fantastic facilities at Macquarie, which we didn't have the first films that I made here, there was something really wonderful about being able to do something in that kind of environment. And the first film that I made in that kind of environment was actually, because it fell over, it was about Charlie Chaplin in India, and the kind of ghosts of Charlie Chaplin in film history. And it kind of nearly got, after years, it nearly got financed, and I did a lot of work with screen historians and so on, and wrote about that, and travelled around looking at archives around the world. It fell over at the last hurdle, which was immensely disappointing, heartbreaking actually. But every filmmaker's story got a story like that. The one that got away, they get bigger and bigger in people's explanations, in my view. Perhaps that happens in other areas as well. But because it didn't seem possible to make that film after a great deal of support, I was looking for a new way to make it, and completely rewrote it and wrote an essay called The Boot Cake that I adapted for a film, and sort of decided to embrace those constraints and relish them and make them with what I have. And being there, I wrote a manifesto about it. And it was an immensely difficult but really, really enjoyable experience, and I'm not convinced that I didn't get a much better film out of that. It was really low budget. I pieced together, it was back when we didn't have this building, we had a shed, and I used to run between lectures and over there. So there was doing all of that, and there was a feature kind of documentary that was shot in India and other places in Australia, and had this sort of flicker of black and white that travelled really widely, and was So I felt that there was enormous freedom, intellectual and creative freedom, in being able to work in environments like that. And I think it had an MQRDG, a research development grant from here for about 50 grand, which was integral to finishing the shoot. And then it kind of got industry money.
Right.
So then the next thing was to start applying for ARC grants, and in this case, teaming up with Shoproom, with social psychologists, and thinking of it more as a kind of interdisciplinary project, with that idea that one of the things that academia offers is if you can come together with, that there was people who had deep expertise, who were mostly in the UK at that time. Then one of them moved to Australia, and I was doing the archival research. They had written some stuff about Zimbardo, a lot actually, and made a film, and were really interested in film, and I suggested to them that they should turn their attention to Milgram, which they did big time. So there's that kind of possibility of being able to spend more time to immerse yourself in archives, to learn. I felt like I was in an incredibly privileged position to learn a lot from people with expertise in other fields. And that was really enjoyable. So it was as if the process of researching and writing was much more integrated rather than this incredibly long development process. And then there's this thing that you've got to make in an incredibly short amount of time. You could easily sign all your rights away, you could get sacked off your own film. I felt like that was not for me, and that this was a much more organic kind of process. And then more and more filmmakers came, and we started doing things like that. And I guess the thing, it probably took several attempts to get the ARC grant, and it was quite a small amount of money deliberately, because we were establishing track record to make Shoproom, which was a feature documentary. So essentially it was like having, because Milgram's experiment was really dramatic, and it loaned itself. There was 30 versions of it, but lots of them had never been seen. And so he had filmed a little bit of it. And so it made sense to film, firstly to examine the drama, and come up with a method of doing that. And secondly, to kind of interrogate that. So we sort of did it one layer at a time, did these long structured improvisations, edited it, added a layer of animation, added some interviews. It was quite a long process, but ultimately I found it a really rewarding process. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does, but it raises a whole bunch more. But I'm thinking that maybe what we should is actually look at the trailer of Shoproom, because I don't know if everybody's seen it, and it's, it's worth looking at. So yeah.
This machine generates electric shocks. These switches here indicate the voltage of the shock. Press this button here and the Luna gets an electric shock.
Get me out of here!
Please carry on. The experiment requires that you continue. It's absolutely essential that you continue. You don't have a choice, you need to carry on. Administer the
I'm not doing this. I'm sorry.
I wouldn't go on if I thought he was being harmed.
What do you mean I don't have a choice?
So good. So good.
I
And
guess to answer your question, one of the things, the key ideas was clearly that psychologists and social scientists thought of film as a kind of objective media that could be used to film, like if you trace it back to the kind of scientific lab, almost as a camera in a laboratory. The camera was an instrument in a laboratory, and in the book I've traced some of the history of that. So the idea is really to kind of challenge that and say that it's not an objective instrument, and that those films can be challenged. And wanting to make films that offered alternative explanations, but also had a more essayistic kind of tilt, and provided more interpretive space for audiences. That's essentially one of the things that I was
So
doing.
you're really actually doing two really interesting things. One of them is investigating these experiments as dramas, and another one is investigating the kind of story that they popularized and saying, well, maybe there's another story. And both of those, in a sense, you're interrogating form and you're interrogating the ideas, which is it's really rich and inventive, and I mean there's something in to bring that back to the book as well, because I feel like that's really happening in this book, that there's both an interrogation of form and an interrogation of the principle or story or assertion that has been made by the psychologists, and it's really exciting, and that's why it's so exciting to read. I mean, in chapter 3, right, New Haven Noir is the title of chapter 3, and it's there's you say, I felt like I was in a film noir myself. You were there, and the writing brings us into this noir world, but it's also investigating what was Stanley Milgram doing? What was he thinking about noir or thinking about audiences in that way? And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that experience of New Haven and being part of it, being a noir investigator. I mean, in a sense, your voice becomes this kind of investigative detective voice.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I guess most of my films and writing has posited me as an investigator in some way. My dad was a detective, I believe. I got that long time ago. I longed for his black notebooks as a child. I really loved the idea of the investigator. I got my own notebooks. It's pretty good. So I like that idea of the investigator, but not investigating a crime. It also comes back to this idea of history. Historiography has been really important to my work, and I think that I talk about that, the idea of history as a double investigation in which every aspect of the investigation is important. So as well as going to the archive and actually going through, in the case of the Milgram archive, something like 100 boxes, which I did multiple times. I think I visited there about 4 times. Your impressions about being in that place. New Haven, where Yale is, and the Milgram archives, is a kind of slightly uncomfortable place. It's two worlds. It's this gorgeous kind of, place of intellect and ideas, where everyone's kind of welcome with these beautiful buildings in autumn and so on. But it also is home to some of the poorest people in America. It's a place of enormous kind of divide. Historically, it's been a place of great violence, etc. So there's always that kind of shadow there. And also Milgram's experiment was one that the people in the town felt very, caused some people to feel very happy that they contributed to learning something new about human nature, and others to be very concerned about whether something terrible was kind of going on. So for me, it's not so much that Milgram was thinking about noir, it's that when I went through debriefs, recorded debriefs with, he got a psychiatrist to debrief the people who felt most badly about the experiments in a questionnaire that he did. Some who were quite disturbed, because they were, to be fair, a minority. And this psychiatrist conducted debriefs, which I think was partly a public relations exercise, but was also genuinely to try and make people feel kind of better. I spent New Haven Noir is really about that, and taking that idea of that the stories we tell are to do with the narrative resources that we have available. I guess my feeling, immersing myself in those stories and reading them and imagining them, was that they had an element of noir, as if, and I kind of, and some of the stuff, screenwriting, kind of screen theory about noir that I find most resonant, talks about noir as having been more about atmosphere than plot. And I strongly agree with that. And it's why I think that it is very adaptable and usable as a kind of narrative resource. So not only do I think that the residents, some of the participants did that, and I would argue that they turned it into a kind of subset of noir that I would call, that's called documentary semi-noir or something, which is always about ordinary citizens investigating and in fact turning the tables on authority. So I think I'm positing both the participants in those debriefs as being part of such an investigation, and myself, that I'm an ordinary citizen being part of that. I guess the other thing I quickly say about that is I'm 1000% committed to academic scholarly writing that is lively, is interesting, to the best of my ability. I think that there's a really rich tradition of scholarly writing that draws on all the resources that non-fiction has available, and yet is no less, and indeed fiction, and has no less scholarly kind of rigour. I think that being an interdisciplinary scholar compels you to use clear language, to not use jargon, and that's the space that I personally am really interested in and committed to. And I feel that this book gave me some opportunities to explore that, just as many other people may be exploring those things.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. And I mean, it's interesting, the kind of sense of, one thing that comes through really strongly is a sense that you have a responsibility as a storyteller, that you take that very seriously in terms of both creating a voice that we can access easily, but also there's this really, I got to page 94 and I just had to stop and think about this line so much. So you're writing in the chapter 6 about crime scenes and about Philip Zimbardo, the director of the original Stanford prison experiments, and how he continues to kind of promote his idea and inject it into images and repeat images. And there's a whole interesting thing about John Berger telling us how images amplify themselves and so forth. You say that, so what gets described in this chapter is the way that Zimbardo's telling a story, and that story gets adapted quite strongly in the public imagination and creates this, his story is that living in big cities alienates us, and we need more police walking on the streets to keep the peace and to fix the broken windows and so forth. And this, Kathryn writes, fixing broken windows had morphed into the racist stop and frisk policy. And I really thought, wow. And a few pages later, Kathryn writes, why would you convince people of ideas about human behavior that might be wrong?
Look, I think that obviously I'm very critical of Zimbardo's work. I think he spent a lifetime promoting an experiment, inverted commas, with a lot of a deliberate lack of clarity around its protocols and how it might actually be an experiment. This idea of something being both an experiment and a drama is fascinating. But I think if many people have criticised Zimbardo for the extreme lack of clarity about that. Milgram is someone I have a great deal more respect for, even if I'm critical about some of his work. And I think in the first chapter I talk about some of the kind of prehistory or early history of psychology and film. I talk about the way that Zimbardo was very involved, and Stanford, actually Stanford doesn't have a good track record in this area, brought up, there's this idea that candid camera was kind of social science for the masses and was research. That is many steps too far, in my opinion. The whole notion of the hidden camera, but it is true that to some extent Some of these psychologists borrowed the notion of the hidden camera for that, but really exaggerated claims were made about programs like Candid Camera, which actually, were aimed at catching people out and embarrassing them. And, they're not all that great about human behaviour, but there were these kinds of sponsored symposium at universities, one of which Zimbardo was involved in, where those Candid Camera programs were used as teaching materials in a way that gave them a kind of intellectual responsibility, etc. I think of Zimbardo as a kind of huckster or salesman, and that's one of the things I write about in that area. The crime scene thing, I guess, looking at the landmark experiments, I became really aware that John Berger's idea of the more you link something to, the more images that you link something to, the more influential it is. And I think that that's what Zimbardo was a master at, of taking inadequately prepared, shoddy, I do say it in more restrained terms in the book, we don't have a lot of time, and we're covering a lot of territory.
We are, and we need to get to some other people's questions as well. So,
I think that he spent really most of his career selling an ill-prepared, questionable kind of experiment for financial gain. So there definitely are all kinds of ethics around that. I'd also like to say that he's been astonishingly generous about making his materials available, including to me, and I appreciate that, and I think that ethically that is the right thing to do, to open those things up to scrutiny, and that's exactly what. But I think all of these experiments play on fear.
Yeah.
They're all crime scenes.
Yeah.
Indeed, the parable, the Good Samaritan experiments are all based on that parable. And the Road to Jericho was a crime scene,
Right.
and it just plays out over and over on all of these things. There's just another side of the story that needs to be told.
Indeed, and you tell it, and I appreciate that. I want to just, are there questions, Tom, coming in, Tom? Because we could go on here and show other clips and stuff like that. But
yeah, so I have said in the chat, for those of you who are listening in Zoom, but of course our live audience as well are free to ask questions if you so desire as well, that now we have about 10 minutes left. So now is the time, if you have any burning questions for Kathryn, now is the time to ask. So we have a number of ways to do that. You can ask in chat, you can raise your hand, and you can speak through Zoom, or of course those of you in the room can of course ask questions as well.
you should ask about the bystander effect, and then we'll show the clip.
We should do it the other way around, show the clip and then.
All right.
Okay.
How about while people think about what their questions
so we're
are,
going to show.
We'll go to the other clip, because Kathryn's latest film is called The Bystander's Effect. Sorry, Bystander Story.
Bystander Story, I think.
Bystander Story. Sorry, and it's again taking this idea that we've all accepted, because the psychologist did the experiment, so of course this is the truth, and looking at it from another perspective.
Yeah, I'm going to reshare that, and this time make sure it will actually work. Here we go.
Psychologists have conducted hundreds of experiments looking at the effect of the presence of others on your willingness to help. And they came to call this the bystander effect.
Right now. He's not responsive right now, bro. Just give him a pulse. No, bro, look at him. He's not responsive right now, bro.
By looking at these events, psychologists have been able to change the story about bystander behavior. It's a story of strangers helping other strangers.
It's not about individuals, it's about how we act together to make a difference. The bystanders to the George Floyd murder show us that what we think we know about bystanders is wrong.
I mean, I really find that moving. the film itself is also really substantive and sorry, I should let other people ask questions if you have them.
Yes, so it is, ask now or forever hold your peace.
That's it, or forever let me ask another one. We have questions out there, let's go.
Okay.
I wonder, Kathryn, if you can just talk a little bit about the role of reenactment in both of those films, and maybe touch on how you actually approach your work with actors.
Thank you. Well, I guess these films use very different kinds of reenactment, as you would know, Julianne, having been a collaborator on the Bystander Effect. So I think reenactments of aspects of the experiment so that we can reinterpret them has been kind of key to the films that I've been doing around social psychology or psychology, and then creating a kind of interpretive frame that creates some interpretive space around that. So Shock Room, as I said, there was 30 versions, but only one that is usually very well known, and that's the one in which most people obeyed. But he did all these, Milgram devised all these endless variations of it, and it's extraordinarily dramatic. We were only able to, maybe chose about 4 or 5 of them, including the best known one to show its drama, but also one in which people formed a group to resist. And that used a method of reenactment where I wanted it to look contemporary and almost hyper-real, because when you watch the black and white footage from the 60s, they feel like, firstly, it doesn't represent our community. It's all men, businessmen and some sort of working class guys. There's no women, there's no cultural diversity, even though there was in the experiments more cultural diversity than that. It just doesn't look like us, so it seems very remote. It seems in the past. So we had a much more diverse cast in terms of culture and gender and age, and built a replica of the shock machine in a laboratory kind of studio based on my archival research at Yale. So it was a kind of a replica of those things down to the colours and everything, and did long improvs with actors. So that experiment can go for quite a while, and it's essentially, I think, a structured improvisation. So I worked with actors, having worked with actors quite a lot in, kind of the features that I'd made. I worked to develop a character with each actor. They agreed to be in an experiment, in a kind of filmed improvisation. I promised that they wouldn't be here and that they could stop.
And those who are joining us online, good afternoon, good
at any
morning,
moment.
good evening, wherever you are in the world. It's good to see all of you here face to face, and I can recognize Dani behind the mask. Welcome, Dani. It's good for you to join us.
Someone else is joining us.
Reminds us of the good old days. So thank you.
So we had a long structured improv with characters, hyper-real, 9 cameras.
Maybe if Tom just muted the Mac.
We used the hidden window thing, and there were 3 cameras behind that window, but there were also about 9 GoPros built into the set, so that it was immersive and so that the actors could go wherever they chose to do so. And I worked individually with the actors on their character and created a lot of secrecy around it, which I believed paid off in terms of the kind of feel of it, and really edited that and then added other layers, which has been pretty much the usual thing that I do. Whereas in this film, we started off reenacting some of the CCT footage that psychologists who are arguing were describing some of the ways that people intervene in crises in public and what those dynamics are. We started off reenacting some of those, and that was kind of a really core part of the film. We did it visually. I wanted to do something different. I wanted to create kind of a street scene, a very stylized street scene in a studio, not go with the hyper-real thing. I think it became apparent to us that the actors sort of amplified those dynamics really well, and we needed other stories. I myself, being completely convinced of the psychologist's work about the ways that people intervene, still felt that I wanted more evidence. So I pulled in a lot more kind of stories from a court case in Germany, some of the actors' individual stories from workshops that we did. And so we had a whole lot of, I'd say, more stylized kind of reenactment style, sometimes working from images and sometimes working with transcripts, interspersed with kind of interviews and quite a lot of our own CCTV footage. And then we got permission to use the footage of the George Floyd the murder, but we only look at the way that the bystanders tried to intervene and the way that they worked together. So they were completely different kinds of reenactments. I think I made about 4 social psychology films. Yeah. I also made Experiment 20, which was a very stylized verbatim, I'm calling verbatim noir, which put women back in the picture and was based on transcripts of women. So exploring what I might be able to do with reenactments of those experiments and how we might interpret it, I guess, was the idea.
And just to say, for people on Zoom who don't know, Experiment 20 is online and you can watch the whole of it on The Guardian. If you just Google Experiment 20, Kathryn Millard, I show it to my students all the time. We have one more question. Do we have time for one more, Tom?
We have one in the chat.
Okay,
who possibly came in earlier. Sorry. So Rachel Yuang-Tunguj, hopefully we can
Hi, Rachel.
Yeah.
Hi, lovely to see you. I just wanted to comment on something, Kathryn. One of the things that I've so enjoyed about your films is the way that your films in this regard unpick received stories and narratives. They do more than that. They kind of seem to me to uncover stories under the skin of these stories, as though you're doing a kind of archaeology to get to something, the hidden truths. But what I'm interested in is you talked a bit about the kind of gravity of Zimbardo's account of these particular accounts. And I'm wondering about the kind of choices you have to make in order to counter these accounts. Do you end up becoming entangled in the kinds of ways that Zimbardo makes his decisions, that in order to counter those sorts of stories, you have to engage in some of the same stylistic choices or modes of representation in order to kind of carry out this dialogue and combat some of those ideas and bring out stories that can compete, I suppose, or displace some of those earlier narratives?
No, thank you, Rachel. I think that in terms of film, the person the experimenter whose work I've worked with most has been Milgram. I've written about Zimbardo, but the person whose work I've worked with most is Milgram in the archives. Though I've written a lot about Zimbardo. I think we were acutely aware of that shooting shotgun. It was always every day walking onto that set. I worried that I was exploiting people in the way that Milgram did. It was quite a somber set. One of the most demanding sets that I've ever been. We felt like we'd all been through the ringer by the end of the day, but there was also something very alive there. And I did do some debriefs with the actors myself. Obviously, I met people at the studio door and talked to them and gave them some information, but I also filmed interviews with them later. And when the film was first shown, the actors, particularly Jeanette Cronin, who's collaborator on a lot of my films, who's an extraordinary, not only a great actor, a fantastic person to have in an ensemble. I always think there's people who lead ensembles, whether they're meant to or not, and you have to have some key people who do that. For me, Jeanette's one of those. And so I think that all you can do is I might not get everything right. It's dangerous territory. You're aware of it all of the time. And maybe that's the thing about being in New Haven and thinking about that. But I think you have to keep interrogating that for yourself without driving yourself crazy. With yourself and your collaborators, the questions, I suppose. Because otherwise, how can we challenge those experiments? It's been a really big thing in social psychology, the idea that that those experiments could never be redone and that you had to find ethical ways to do it. And that's something that certainly myself and Alex Haslam in particular talked about a lot. How could we, not so much in terms of filmmaking, but that we were committed to not saying we can't touch these, that's kind of stands, but to saying, no, let's, I wanted to find a way to kind of ethically challenge those. And I guess that's why so much of the book is about, which is my summing up of that 15 years of research and films, is really asking questions about, mostly about Milgram's ethics, Zimbardo's ethics, but also my own.
Yeah.
And how did I come to some decisions about whose stories it was okay to share or not?
Yes, yeah, which is, we particularly get to in the wonderful chapter 7. So I again commend this book to you. I warmly recommend that you pick it up and enjoy it and read it. I'm sure we'll get it in the library, but go ahead, spring for it. You'll like having it on your bookshelf. Kathryn, we're out of time. It's 5 o'clock. I'm sure if you want to chat, we'll get more questions. And thank you everybody for showing up, and thank you, Kathryn, for this wonderful and really exciting discussion. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I will end it there for those of you in chat, just turning off the recording.